Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku fought in the Marvel Civil War beside Iron Man. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The air in Muzutafu crackled with an energy that was both familiar and terrifyingly alien. It smelled of ozone, burnt sugar, and the coppery tang of broken reality. Izuku Midoriya, clad in the tattered remnants of his gamma costume, skidded to a halt on a fractured pavement slab, his boots grinding against loose asphalt. Green lightning, the raw power of one for all thrumming at a manageable 5%, danced around his limbs. Everyone fall back. Maintain a perimeter of at least 200 meters. The voice of the pro-hero Kamui Woods boomed through the chaos, his lacquered arms weaving a desperate cage of wood around the epicenter. It was a futile effort. The villain, a wiry man in a garish purple suit who called himself Distortex, cackled madly as the world around him warped and buckled. His quirk was a nightmare of physics. He didn't create portals in the traditional sense. He folded space-time onto itself, creating shimmering, nauseating pockets of unreality that flickered in and out of existence. A lamppost would suddenly bend into a perfect 90-degree angle, its light spilling onto the ground like liquid. A fire hydrant would stretch like taffy, its stream of water flowing upwards into a sky that momentarily swirled with the colors of a dying nebula. Deku's mind was racing, his signature muttering a low, frantic hum under his breath. Spatial manipulation, but it's unstable. He's not controlling it, just creating chaotic zones. Direct attacks are too risky. Getting caught in a warp could mean anything. Spaghettification? Instant displacement? Need to find a constant, a focal point. His body? Is he immune to his own effects? He seems to be standing perfectly still while everything else warps around him. That must be it. The eye of the storm. He saw his chance. Distortex was laughing, his head thrown back, reveling in the pandemonium. Deku crouched low, pouring more of one for all into his legs. 8%. The strain was a familiar, painful friend, a burning fire in his muscles that told him he was pushing his limits. He shot forward, a green comet against the distorted cityscape. His plan was simple: close the distance faster than the reality around him could collapse. A straight-line shot to neutralize the source. He was 20 meters away when he saw her. A little girl, no older than 6, frozen in terror. She had dropped a small All Might-themed ice cream cone, its contents now a colorful smear on the buckling pavement. A shimmering tear in the air, like heat haze over an open flame, opened directly behind her. It wasn't large, but it was growing, its edges fraying the very fabric of the world. There was no time for analysis. No time for a plan. There was only instinct. Look out! He screamed, pushing his body past its breaking point. The world seemed to slow down. He could see the individual threads in the girl's pink dress, the way her eyes widened in fear, the silent scream forming on her lips. He threw himself forward, his arms outstretched. His gloved fingers brushed against the coarse fabric of her dress, and with a desperate grunt, he shoved her sideways. She tumbled onto the relatively stable ground, safe. He, however, was not. His momentum carried him directly into the path of the anomaly. There was no sensation of heat or cold, no impact. There was only a silent, violent unmaking. For a single, terrifying moment, Izuku Midoriya was everything and nothing. He felt his atoms stretch across an infinite void, saw a billion stars born and die, heard the silent symphony of a universe without sound. It was an agony so profound it transcended pain, a sensory overload that bypassed his nerves and assaulted his very soul. And then, just as suddenly, it was over. He slammed onto a hard, wet surface with a force that knocked the breath from his lungs and sent a galaxy of white-hot stars exploding behind his eyes. The world resolved itself into a symphony of pain. His head throbbed, his ribs ached, and a dozen new scrapes and bruises made themselves known. The stench of stagnant water and rotting garbage filled his nostrils, a thick, cloying smell that made him gag. He pushed himself up onto trembling elbows, his vision swimming. He was in an alley. Red brick walls, stained with grime and graffiti he didn't recognize, rose high on either side of him. A single, flickering fluorescent light cast a sickly yellow glow over a dented dumpster. Rain, or perhaps just runoff from an overflowing gutter, dripped with a steady, hollow rhythm. Where am I? Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of his consciousness. The fight. The villain. The little girl. Was she okay? Was everyone okay? He scrambled for his comms unit, fumbling at his ear. Static. He pulled out the support-grade phone Stark Industries. Wait, no, Detonarat had provided for UA students. The screen was cracked, but it flickered to life. Out of service. Of course. The villain's quirk must have some kind of electromagnetic interference. He probably just got thrown a few blocks away. That had to be it. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to calm his racing heart. Okay, Midoriya. Analyze the situation. You're separated from the other heroes. You're in an unfamiliar alley. Priority 1, re-establish contact and get a sitrep. Priority 2, find a landmark. He stumbled out of the alley's mouth, his body screaming in protest. The immediate sensory assault was staggering. The world wasn't warped or distorted anymore. It was just loud. Louder than any part of Muzurifa he had ever been in. The air was thick with the blare of 1,000 car horns, the shriek of sirens that sounded subtly different from the ones he knew, and a cacophony of voices speaking in a language he only partially understood. English. Fast, clipped, aggressive English, towering buildings, true skyscrapers of glass and steel, clawed at a gray, overcast sky. They were taller than anything in his Japan, packed so densely together they seemed to be fighting for sunlight. Rivers of yellow cars, all of the same boxy design, flowed through the concrete canyons below. And the people, there were so many, a tidal wave of humanity, a sea of faces of every shape and color, washed over the sidewalks. This wasn't just a few blocks away. This wasn't Muzurifa. This wasn't even Japan. His heart hammered against his ribs. He grabbed the arm of a passing man in a business suit. "Excuse me, sir," he said in textbook, slightly stilted English. "Can you please tell me where I am? I need to find the nearest hero agency." The man ripped his arm away, giving Deku's tattered costume a look of profound disgust. "Get lost, cosplayer. Comic-Con ain't for another 3 months." He hurried off, swallowed by the crowd. "Cosplayer?" Deku blinked, confused. He tried again, approaching a woman talking on her phone. "Ma'am, please, I'm a student from UA High School. I was in a villain attack. I need to contact the authorities." The woman didn't even lower her phone. "Beat it, freak," she muttered, sidestepping him without breaking her conversation. Freak. The word hit him like a physical blow. In his world, his costume was a symbol of hope, of an aspiring hero. Here, it was a mark of strangeness, a reason for scorn and dismissal. The isolation was a physical weight, pressing down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. Every face that passed was a stranger. Every building was a monument to his displacement. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone. He spent the next hour in a daze, wandering aimlessly. He saw signs in English for places he never heard of: Broadway, Wall Street, Times Square. The last one was a sensory nightmare, an explosion of light and sound from hundreds of massive digital billboards advertising soft drinks, cars, and movies. It was on one of these screens, nestled between an ad for a new smartphone and a trailer for a romantic comedy, that his world tilted on its axis for the second time that day. It was a news broadcast. A stern-looking woman with blonde hair was speaking, her face grim. The churn at the bottom of the screen read, "Sokovia Accords, the Avengers divided. The debate continues to rage on Capitol Hill and across the globe," the anchorwoman said, her voice echoing from dozens of speakers. Following the catastrophic events in New York, Washington, D.C., Sokovia, and most recently, Lagos, the United Nations has ratified the Sokovia Accords, a document designed to provide oversight and accountability for the Avengers and other enhanced individuals. The screen cut to footage that made Deku's blood run cold. A city reduced to rubble by a floating chunk of land. A massive, green behemoth smashing through buildings. A man in a suit of high-tech red and gold armor firing blasts of energy. And another man, dressed in a red, white, and blue uniform and carrying a circular shield, throwing it with impossible strength. The Avengers? The name was familiar, A whisper from pre-quirk history, like the tales of King Arthur or Hercules. Fictional characters from comic books and movies that his own great-great-grandfather might have enjoyed. But this was real footage. This was happening now. A man with a familiar, handsome face and a well-trimmed goatee appeared on screen. The text identified him as Tony Stark. "We need to be put in check," Stark said, his voice heavy with a weariness that Deku felt in his bones. "Whatever form that takes, I'm game. If we can't accept limitations, we're no better than the bad guys." Then, the other man, the one with the shield. He was blonde, with a square jaw and an expression of unwavering conviction. "Steve Rogers / Captain America. Our duty is to the people," Captain America argued in a different clip, his voice ringing with sincerity. "And I can't stand by and let a government body with its own agenda tell us who to help and when. The safest hands are still our own." Deku stood frozen on the crowded sidewalk, oblivious to the people jostling past him. His analytical mind, his greatest tool as a hero, kicked into overdrive, trying to process the impossible. He was in a world without quirks, but with enhanced individuals. A world with heroes, the Avengers, who operated without licenses, without government oversight, without the entire framework that his society was built upon, and they were fighting. Not against villains, but against each other. Over the very principle of accountability, his mind flashed back to his own world. To the Hero Public Safety Commission. To the strict laws governing quirk usage. To the rigorous training at UA to earn a provisional license. He thought of the destruction he had witnessed, the damage caused by All Might and All for One in their legendary battles, battles that had reshaped coastlines. Even the greatest symbol of peace operated within a system. He had a license. He was accountable. He thought of Stain, the hero killer, and his twisted crusade against false heroes. Stain's ideology was monstrous, but the seed of it came from a fear of unchecked power, a fear that was now playing out on a global scale in this new, terrifying world. He looked at the face of Tony Stark and saw the logic. The responsibility. The painful necessity of rules. He looked at Captain America and saw the nobility, the unwavering desire to do good. Both sides felt right. And that was the most terrifying part. A wave of dizziness washed over him. The pain from his injuries, the shock, the sheer existential vertigo of his situation, it was all crashing down on him. He stumbled away from the blinding lights of Times Square, seeking refuge in the comparative quiet of a side street. He needed to think. He needed to sit down. He found another alley, this one darker and narrower than the first. He slid down the cool, damp brick wall, pulling his knees to his chest. He was a hero in training, but right now he just felt like a scared, lost kid. He closed his eyes, and the faces of his friends flashed through his mind. Uraraka's cheerful smile, Ida's rigid, supportive posture, Todoroki's quiet intensity, Kaken's explosive anger, Mr. Aizawa's tired but watchful gaze, All Might's booming, reassuring laugh. A tear traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. They were in another dimension. Another reality. He might never see them again. The thought was a physical blow, so devastating it left him breathless. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting back a sob. No. You can't fall apart. Not now. Not here. What would All Might do? He would smile. He would face the impossible with a smile and find a way forward. A scream shattered his spiraling thoughts. It came from deeper in the alley. It was a woman's voice, sharp with terror. Deku was on his feet in an instant, the exhaustion and despair vaporized by a surge of adrenaline. His pain was a distant echo. His fear was a tool to be sharpened. This was what he was. This was what he did. He crept forward, his battered boots making no sound on the wet pavement. Peeking around the corner of a large dumpster, he saw the scene. Two large, burly men had a woman cornered. One of them held a knife, its blade glinting in the dim light. The other was grabbing at her purse. "Just give us the bag, lady, and nobody gets hurt," the one with the knife growled, his voice a low rumble. "Please," the woman whimpered, her back pressed against the wall. "Please, just take it. Don't hurt me." Deku's blood ran cold, then hot. There were no pro-heroes to call. No police in sight. There was just him. Here, in this world, he was an unknown. Unlicensed. An anomaly. Using his power was a risk. It would draw attention he couldn't afford. But the alternative was to do nothing. To stand by while someone was hurt. And that was not an option. It had never been an option. Peter, when you can do the things that I can, but you don't, and then the bad things happen. They happen because of you. The line, from a pre-Quirk movie his mom had shown him once, echoed in his head with perfect clarity. He took a deep breath, centering himself. He couldn't use a smash. Too destructive. Too loud. He needed precision. Control. One for all, full cowling. 5%. The familiar green energy coursed through him, a comforting warmth against the cold dread. He stepped out from behind the dumpster. Hey, he called out, his voice steady despite the frantic beating of his heart. Leave her alone. The two muggers turned, their faces a mixture of surprise and amusement. They took in his strange green costume, the rabbit-like ears on his cowl, the ridiculous oversized gloves. What's this? The one holding the purse sneered. Little man in pajamas thinks he's a hero? The one with the knife chuckled darkly. Get lost, kid, before you get yourself cut. They took a step towards him, dismissing him as a threat. That was their mistake. Deku moved. To them, it must have looked like he teleported. One moment he was 10 feet away, the next he was right in front of the knife wielder. He didn't throw a punch. He didn't need to. He flicked the index finger of his right hand. Delaware smash. Air Force. It wasn't a true smash. It was a tiny, focused application of the technique. A controlled burst of 5% power, channeled into a single point. The result was not an explosion, but a sharp, powerful thump of compressed air, like a giant invisible fist. It struck the mugger's wrist. There was a sickening crack. The knife flew from his nerveless fingers and clattered against the far wall. The man howled, clutching his shattered wrist. The other muggers stared in shock for a half-second. It was all the time Deku needed. He pivoted, dropping low and sweeping the man's legs out from under him. The man hit the ground with a heavy grunt. Before he could recover, Deku had him pinned, one hand on his chest. It's over, Deku said, his voice low and firm. The man with the broken wrist, cradling his arm, scrambled to his feet. He looked at Deku, his eyes wide with a terror that was deeply satisfying. He then looked at his downed compatriot, turned, and fled the alley without a second thought. The other mugger, seeing his odds, shoved Deku away and scrambled after him, disappearing into the city's labyrinth. Deku let them go. His objective was complete. The woman was safe. He turned to her. She was staring at him, her hand over her mouth, her eyes as wide as saucers. Are you all right, ma'am? He asked, his English soft and earnest. She didn't answer at first. She was looking at him not with gratitude, but with a mixture of awe and fear. As if he wasn't a person, but some strange force of nature. What are you? She finally stammered. The question stung more than he expected. Not who, but what. I'm just someone who wants to help, he said quietly. He heard the distant, approaching wail of the sirens he'd heard earlier. The police. He couldn't be here. He was an unregistered enhanced individual. For all he knew, they'd try to arrest him. Without another word, he turned and sprinted back the way he came. He vaulted over a chain-link fence at the end of another alley, the green lightning of full cowling flaring for a moment before he let it die down. He landed silently on the other side and melted back into the anonymous, uncaring crowds of New York City, his heart a painful, tangled knot of heroic pride and profound loneliness. Upstate New York, Avengers Compound. Tony Stark stared at the holographic projection of the Sokovia Accords, the blue text seeming to mock him. 117 nations had signed. 117 nations agreed that the Avengers were a weapon that needed a leash. And Steve was fighting him on it as if he were the enemy. The compound was silent. Quiet as a tomb. Vision was likely meditating somewhere, Rhodey was in D.C., and Wanda was confined to her room, for her own good. For everyone's good. It felt less like a headquarters and more like a gilded prison of his own making. He took a long sip of his coffee, the third espresso in an hour. He hadn't slept in 36 hours. His mind was a maelstrom of guilt, frustration, and the crushing weight of responsibility. Sokovia. Ultron. Lagos. It all came back to him. His creations. His mistakes. The Accords were his penance. Boss, a calm, synthesized female voice echoed through the lab. FRIDY. Not now, Friday. I'm busy staring into the abyss, Tony muttered, pinching the bridge of his nose. Apologies for the intrusion, the AI continued, her tone unperturbed. But I am detecting an anomalous energy event in downtown Manhattan. It occurred approximately 1 hour ago, but I have just finished cross-referencing the energy signature against all known databases. And? Tony asked, his interest piqued despite himself. Let me guess, Thor's back from his intergalactic spa day? Negative. The energy signature is unlike anything on file. It registered a significant discharge of tachyon particles and created a localized atmospheric displacement consistent with a spontaneous wormhole event, albeit a microscopic and unstable one. The residual energy is unusual. It appears to be biological in origin. Tony swiveled in his chair, his fatigue momentarily forgotten. Biological? Pull up everything you've got. Satellite imagery, traffic cams, social media. A series of holographic windows materialized in the air in front of him. One showed a satellite heat map with a fading, pinprick bloom of energy in a specific city block. Another cycled through dozens of grainy security camera feeds. The initial event was concentrated in an alleyway. There was no CCTV coverage, FRIDY reported. However, approximately 10 minutes ago, a secondary, smaller spike of the same energy signature was detected 3 blocks north of the initial event. Show me, Tony commanded. A new window opened, displaying footage from a security camera mounted on the corner of a bodega. It was low resolution, filmed through a light drizzle. It showed a dark alley across the street. 2 men came sprinting out of it, one clutching his arm. A moment later, a woman emerged, looking shaken. That's not an energy spike, that's a mugging, Tony said, unimpressed. Filter for the energy reading. Applying filter, FRIDY said. The image reprocessed, highlighting energy signatures. The 2 fleeing men had normal biosignatures. The woman did too, but for a few seconds, deep within the alley, a new figure appeared, glowing with a faint, emerald light on the filtered screen. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Freeze and enhance that, Tony ordered, leaning forward. The image sharpened, pixelated but clear enough. It was a kid. A teenager, by the looks of him, dressed in some kind of ridiculous green bunny costume. The energy FRIDY had detected was flaring around him like an aura. Run it back, slow motion. 100th speed, Tony said, his mind kicking into high gear. He watched the footage again. The green figure appeared. There was a flicker of movement, too fast to properly see. A focused burst of something. Tony watched as the air itself seemed to ripple, striking one of the assailants. He replayed it a dozen times, his analytical brain dissecting every frame. It wasn't a repulsor blast. It wasn't magic. It wasn't like anything he'd ever seen. It was a kinetic force, generated by the kid himself. And the control, the attack was precise enough to shatter a wrist without leveling the alley. Power and precision. A dangerous combination. And the suit. It looked homemade, but the design was oddly professional, like a uniform. A mask, gloves, reinforced boots, FRIDY, run facial recognition. Cross-reference with every database we have. Shield, Interpol, the whole alphabet soup. There was a pause. No matches, boss? The subject does not appear in any known database. His biometrics are not on file anywhere on Earth. Not on file. A spontaneous wormhole event. A unique biological energy signature. A kid in a strange uniform with controlled, superhuman power. Tony Stark leaned back in his chair, a slow grin spreading across his face for the first time in days. The world was falling apart. His friends hated him. The government was breathing down his neck. But the universe, in its infinite and chaotic wisdom, had just dropped a brand new mystery right in his lap. And Tony Stark loved a good mystery. Well, now, he said to the empty lab. This is interesting. He stood up, stretching his arms. The fatigue had vanished, replaced by a familiar spark of purpose. FRIDY, track his location, keep it non-invasive. And get my suit ready. Not the whole tin can. Something a little more approachable. He strode towards the workshop, a new problem to solve, a new variable in an already impossible equation. He had no idea if this kid was a friend or a foe, a threat or an asset. But in a world that was rapidly forcing him to choose sides, a powerful, unregistered, and completely unknown player had just appeared on the board. And Tony was determined to get to him before anyone else did. The rain had started an hour ago, a cold, persistent drizzle that soaked through the tears in Izuku Midoriya's costume and chilled him to the bone. He huddled in the doorway of a closed bookstore, the meager overhang offering little protection. Every muscle in his body ached with a deep, profound exhaustion. The initial adrenaline of his arrival and the subsequent mugging had long since faded, leaving behind a gnawing hunger and the shivering reality of his predicament. He was alone, injured, and a complete unknown in a world that bristled with a cold, intimidating energy. He had spent the last few hours trying to be logical, to be the strategist present Mike always praised. He needed information. He needed to understand the rules of this new world before he could hope to find a way back to his own. The problem was, information cost money, and he had none. The few yen in his utility belt were useless trinkets here. He couldn't buy food, couldn't rent a room, couldn't even use a payphone if he could find one. His stomach growled, a hollow, painful cramp. He hadn't eaten since before the fight with Distortex, and the constant, low-level burn of One for All, even just keeping it simmering beneath his skin for emergencies, was draining his reserves faster than he could have imagined. He was running on fumes. He pushed himself away from the doorway, his joints groaning in protest. He needed to find shelter, somewhere warm and dry where he could think. A library. The thought struck him with the force of a revelation. A public library would be warm, free, and most importantly, filled with knowledge. He could learn about this world's history, its geography, its heroes. He could find a map, formulate a plan. It was the most Deku-like solution he could possibly conceive. Spying a sign for the New York Public Library on a street corner, he began the long, weary trek, keeping his head down, trying to make the tattered green costume seem as inconspicuous as possible. It was a futile effort. He drew stares, whispers, and the occasional jeer, but he ignored them, his focus narrowed to that single, desperate goal. Inside, the library was a cathedral of silence and warmth. The air smelled of old paper and floor polish, a comforting, academic scent that immediately soothed his frayed nerves. He found a secluded corral in a section labeled Modern History and began to pull books from the shelves, his hands trembling slightly. The Battle of New York, an oral history. Shield. Declassified. The Fall of the Triskelion. Saving Sokovia. Triumph and Tragedy of the Avengers. He lost himself in the pages, his analytical mind devouring the information. He cross-referenced eyewitness accounts of the Chitauri invasion with tactical breakdowns of the Avengers' strategies. He sketched the schematics of a helicarrier in the margins of his own battered notebook, which he had thankfully had tucked into a pouch on his belt. He diagrammed the flight patterns of the Iron Man suit and calculated the probable kinetic force of Captain America's shield throws. He was so engrossed, so completely absorbed in this new, fascinating, and terrifying world of heroes, that he didn't hear the soft, almost silent footsteps approaching his table. Nice PJs, very verdant. The voice was smooth, laced with a casual, confident sarcasm that cut through the library's reverent hush. Deku yelped, jumping so hard he nearly knocked over his chair. He spun around to see a man standing there, leaning against a bookshelf. He was dressed in a ridiculously expensive-looking dark suit over a black t-shirt, with sunglasses perched on his nose despite the dim indoor lighting. Deku's brain stuttered, short-circuited, and then rebooted with a single, deafening realization. The face. The goatee. The arc reactor faintly glowing through his shirt. It was Tony Stark, the real, actual, living and breathing Tony Stark. A man he had only seen on a giant television screen 3 hours ago. A man who was, in this world, the equivalent of All Might and David Shield rolled into one impossibly charismatic package. Why you're... Deku stammered, his face flushing a violent shade of crimson. Words, his constant companions, deserted him completely. His mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no sounds came out. Tony Stark pushed his sunglasses up onto his forehead, revealing eyes that were sharp, intelligent, and unnervingly perceptive. They flickered from Deku's wide, starstruck eyes to the tattered costume, to the furiously scribbled analyses in his notebook. A flicker of something, amusement? Intrigue, crossed his face. Me, he confirmed, with a small, self-satisfied smirk. And you, judging by the tachyon residue you're practically leaking, are a long, long way from home. Let's call you Green Rabbit. Deku flinched. It's Deku. The name came out as a weak squeak. Deku, Tony repeated, testing the sound of it. Gesundheit. Look, kid, you caused a bit of a stir on my deep space and interdimensional weirdness sensors. Normally, I'd send a welcome wagon with a lot more laser-based defense systems, but you seemed more lost puppy than alien invader on the security feeds. Plus, the whole beatdown in the alley? Nice form. Very efficient. Deku's mind was reeling. He saw that? He has sensors that can detect me? Tony pushed himself off the bookshelf and took a step closer. He wasn't overtly threatening, but his presence was immense, radiating an aura of power and intellect that was almost overwhelming. Here's the thing, he said, his voice lowering slightly. You're a superpowered unknown who just popped into existence in the middle of my city during a particularly sensitive political climate. That makes you my business. So you can either come with me willingly, and I'll even buy you a burger, or you can try to run, and we find out if that green lightning of yours is faster than my Sunday drive suit. And for the record, he added, with a wry grin, it's not. The offer, framed as it was, wasn't really a choice. But the mention of food sent a pang of desperate hunger through Deku's stomach that was impossible to ignore. A burger. A real meal. And this was Tony Stark, Iron Man. He was a hero. He wouldn't hurt him. Probably. Deku swallowed hard, his throat dry. A cheeseburger? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Tony's grin widened. Kid, you have no idea. The drive upstate was a silent, surreal blur. Deku sat in the plush leather passenger seat of a car so sleek and futuristic it looked like it belonged in a sci-fi movie. He watched the rain-streaked skyscrapers of New York City give way to the lush, green countryside, his mind a whirlwind of disbelief. He was in a car with Tony Stark. He was on his way to a place called the Avengers Compound. It was all too much to process. The compound itself was breathtaking. A series of gleaming, modern buildings of glass and steel nestled in a sprawling, wooded estate. It was larger and more advanced than anything he had ever seen, making even UA's state-of-the-art campus look quaint by comparison. Tony led him through a cavernous, sparsely populated common area into a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a five-star restaurant. "FRIDY," Tony said to the air. "Get a couple of cheeseburgers on the grill, the works. And a first aid kit. Our guest looks like he tangled with a garbage disposal." "Right away, boss," a calm, female voice replied from an unseen speaker, making Deku jump again. "An AI?" Deku stammered, looking around wildly. "The one and only," Tony said, gesturing for Deku to sit at a large, polished island. "Now let's see to those scrapes before you drip all over my floor." As Tony expertly and impersonally cleaned and dressed the cuts on his arms and face, Deku remained mostly silent, still overwhelmed. The promised cheeseburgers arrived shortly after, delivered by a small, hovering drone. They were thick, juicy, and smelled like heaven. Deku ate his first one in what felt like 3 bites, the taste so rich and savory it was almost an emotional experience. He barely restrained himself from inhaling the second one just as quickly. Tony watched him, a thoughtful expression on his face. He took a slow bite of his own burger before speaking. "All right, Deku. I gave you the burger. Now you give me the story. All of it. Where did you come from? What is that energy you're throwing around? And what's with the superhero get-up?" Deku finished chewing a large bite of food and wiped his mouth on a napkin. He took a deep breath. This was it. He reached into the pouch on his belt and pulled out his hero notebook. He flipped it open to a fresh page. It was the only way he knew how to explain. I'm from a different world," he began, his voice gaining a little confidence as he shifted to a topic he was comfortable with. A different dimension, I think. In my world, about 80% of the population is born with a special ability. We call them quirks. Tony leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. Quirks? Like mutations? Sort of, Deku said, his pen starting to fly across the page. He drew a quick, surprisingly detailed sketch of his own arm, with lines of energy flowing through it. My quirk is called One for All. It's a power that's passed down from person to person, stockpiling strength. The green energy, that's me using a small percentage of it. It lets me move faster and hit harder. He flipped the page and started sketching again. A diagram of Bakugo, complete with explosive sweat glands. My friend, his quirk lets him secrete nitroglycerin-like sweat from his palms and ignite it to create explosions. Another page. A drawing of Uraraka touching an object, with arrows indicating the negation of gravity. Another friend can make anything she touches with all 5 fingers weightless. For the next hour, Deku poured out everything. He explained the dawn of the age of quirks, the societal chaos that followed, and the rise of a new profession, pro-hero. He sketched the UA high school crest, explaining the concept of hero academies, schools specifically designed to train the next generation of licensed heroes. He talked about the Hero Public Safety Commission, the government body that regulated hero activity, issued licenses, and dictated the laws of quirk usage in public. He spoke with passion and earnestness, his hands moving as he talked, his pen a constant blur. He explained the concept of provisional licenses, which allowed students like him to use their powers in the field under the supervision of a pro. He talked about the importance of minimizing collateral damage, of prioritizing civilian safety above all else. Tony listened, silent and intense. He didn't interrupt. He just watched, his sharp eyes taking in every detail, every sketch, every frantic explanation. He saw the fierce intelligence in the boy's eyes, the unshakable, almost naive sincerity in his voice. This wasn't a lie. It was too detailed, too complex, too heartfelt to be a fabrication. When Deku finally paused, breathless, to take a drink of water, Tony spoke, his voice quiet and measured. So in your world, you can't just put on a suit and call yourself a hero. You have to be trained, licensed, and regulated by the government. Deku nodded vigorously. Of course. Using a powerful quirk without training is incredibly dangerous. People could get hurt. Property could be destroyed. The laws are there to protect people, to make sure heroes are, well, heroic. That they're accountable. The word hung in the air between them. Accountable. Tony stood up and walked over to the large wall that was, until that moment, a sleek, dark gray. He tapped it, and it shimmered to life, transforming into a massive, wraparound holographic display. Images and videos began to play across it. A swirling blue portal opening in the sky above New York City. Alien creatures pouring out, leveling buildings. A helicarrier falling from the sky over Washington, D.C., an entire city being ripped from the earth, rising into the clouds. A marketplace in Lagos, Nigeria, the side of a building blown out, smoke and fire everywhere. Deku stared, his eyes wide with horror. He had seen news clips in Times Square, but this was different. This was raw, unfiltered footage. The scale of the destruction was immense, far beyond anything he had ever witnessed firsthand. This is us, Tony said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual wit. This is the Avengers. We're the most powerful people on the planet. We've saved the world, more than once. But we operate with no oversight. We have no one to answer to. We go where we want, we fight who we want, and we leave a trail of destruction in our wake. He pointed to the footage of Lagos. A few weeks ago, we were trying to stop a terrorist. We did. But we made a mistake. 12 innocent people died. Not killed by the bad guy. Killed by us. The guilt in his voice was a palpable thing. It was the same guilt Deku had felt when he broke his own bones, when he put others at risk. It was the weight of a hero. The governments of the world, 117 of them, got together, Tony continued, swiping his hand. The footage was replaced by the dense, legalistic text of a document. The title at the top read, The Sokovia Accords. They drafted these. A set of laws to govern us. To make us accountable. A UN panel would oversee the Avengers. We wouldn't be a private army anymore. We'd be a public one, deployed when and where the world decides we're needed. Deku read the text, his mind racing. He saw the logic. It was a scaled-up, international version of his own world's hero Public Safety Commission. It was sensible. It was responsible. But why is it dividing you? Deku asked, looking up at Tony. Doesn't everyone agree? A sad, bitter smile touched Tony's lips. No. Not everyone. Captain America. Steve Rogers, he doesn't. The image of Captain America, resolute and defiant, appeared on the screen. Steve believes this puts us under the control of politicians with agendas, Tony explained. He thinks the safest hands are still our own. He trusts his own judgment more than any committee. He believes that if we sign this, we'll be prevented from helping people when the committee decides it's not in their best interest. Deku looked at the two opposing viewpoints. He saw Tony's weary responsibility and Captain America's unwavering idealism. His mind immediately went to the greatest battle his world had ever known, All Might versus All for One. He remembered the stories, the footage of the aftermath. An entire city ward leveled. Thousands injured. The collateral damage was astronomical. Even the symbol of peace, the greatest hero to have ever lived, had to answer for the consequences of his power. All Might worked within the system, not above it. He followed the rules. It was part of what made him a true hero. But then, a flicker. A strange, cold sensation buzzed at the base of his skull, a whisper of static from the core of One for All. He felt a phantom presence, a sense of deep unease, as if one of the vestiges within him was stirring in protest. A woman's voice, faint and distant, seemed to echo in his soul. Blind faith in a system is its own kind of prison. He shook his head, pushing the feeling away. It was just the stress, the displacement. Logically, rationally, Tony Stark was right. Power without accountability was the definition of a villain. I think I understand, Deku said, his voice quiet but firm. He looked Tony Stark in the eye. In my world, this wouldn't even be a debate. It's a hero's duty to be accountable, to follow the rules set in place to protect the very people we swear to defend. It's the first thing they teach us at UA. A wave of relief so profound it was almost visible washed over Tony's features. The tension in his shoulders seemed to lessen. He had been fighting this battle alone, surrounded by people who either disagreed with him, or were too afraid to take a stand. And now, out of thin air, came a kid from another dimension who was the living embodiment of his argument. The thing is, kid, Tony said, his voice regaining some of its old confidence. This isn't a debate anymore. It's becoming a fight. Steve is protecting his friend, a wanted fugitive, and he's not going to back down. I have to bring him in. I have to show the world that we can police our own, that the Accords can work. He walked over to Deku, his expression deadly serious. You're powerful. You're trained. And you believe in what I'm doing. I wouldn't ask this if I had any other choice, but I'm running out of friends fast. He held out his hand. It was an offer. An invitation. An alliance. I need your help, Deku. Fight with me. Help me stop Captain America. Deku looked at Tony's outstretched hand. This was insane. He was a first-year high school student from Yuzurifu, Japan. He was being asked to fight in a war between living legends, to stand against Captain America, a hero whose comics he had read, a symbol of unwavering good. But what was the alternative? To stand by and do nothing? To refuse the only person who had offered him help, shelter, and a path forward. He thought about his own drive, the burning need to be a hero. A hero didn't just fight villains. A hero did what was right, even when it was hard. Even when it meant fighting other heroes. Responsibility. Accountability. These were the accords of a hero. He took Tony Stark's hand. It was warm and firm. A handshake that crossed dimensions. Okay, Izuku Midoriya said, his voice filled with a resolve that surprised even himself. I'll help you. Later that night, Tony showed him to a room. It was less of a room and more of a luxury suite, with a king-sized bed, a private bathroom, and a floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the dark, sprawling grounds of the compound. A set of clean, simple gray sweats and a black t-shirt were laid out on the bed. "FRIDY can get you anything you need," Tony said from the doorway. "Get some rest. We've got a lot of work to do. And we might be taking a little trip to Germany soon." He paused, his hand on the doorframe. "And kid?" "Thanks." Then he was gone, the door sliding shut with a soft hiss. Deku stood alone in the center of the impossibly large room. The silence was absolute. He felt a fresh wave of homesickness wash over him, so intense it made his chest ache. He missed his mom. He missed his friends. He missed the familiar weight of his own school uniform. He reached into the pouch on his belt, his fingers closing around the one thing he had that connected him to his old life. He pulled it out and set it on the polished nightstand. It was a small, slightly battered Silver Age All Might figurine, one he'd carried with him for years for good luck. The plastic hero stood there, grinning his iconic, indomitable grin, one fist raised to the sky. In the reflection of the massive window, Deku could see his own tired, determined face. He was stranded in a new world, on the brink of a war he barely understood, aligned with a man of iron against a man of principle. He was terrified, but as he looked at the smiling figurine, he remembered All Might's words, the words that were the foundation of his entire being. "It's fine now." "Why?" "Because I am here." He couldn't be there for his world right now. But he was here, in this one. And there were people who needed help. An ideal to be fought for. A responsibility to be upheld. He wasn't in UA anymore. His lesson plan had just changed. And the final exam was going to be a civil war. Izuku Midori awoke to the gentle, synthesized chime of a clock he hadn't set. For a disorienting moment, he thought he was back in his dorm at UA, the morning sun filtering through his All Might-themed curtains. But the sheets were impossibly soft, the mattress seemed to conform perfectly to his body, and the air was still and silent, lacking the familiar morning bustle of Ada organizing a pre-breakfast study session or Bakugo shouting at someone down the hall. He sat up, the gray sweats he'd been given feeling alien against his skin. His gaze fell upon the All Might figurine on the nightstand, a tiny, colorful anchor in this vast, sterile, and luxurious new world. Reality came crashing back in. He was in the Avengers compound. He had agreed to help Tony Stark. He was about to fight Captain America. A wave of nervous energy, sharp and electric, jolted through him. He couldn't just lie here. He had to prepare. He was halfway through his morning katas, a series of stretches and controlled movements to get his body accustomed to the flow of One for All, when the door to his room hissed open. Tony Stark stood there, holding 2 mugs, a tablet tucked under his arm. He was dressed in grease-stained jeans and a faded black Sabbath t-shirt. He looked less like a billionaire industrialist and more like a rock-and-roll dad. "Rise and shine, Emerald City," Tony said, raising an eyebrow at Deku's focused, disciplined movements. "Didn't take you for a morning person. Or whatever that is. Interdimensional yoga?" Deku stopped mid-stretch, his face immediately flushing with embarrassment. "Gee, good morning, Mr. Stark. I'm sorry, I was just warming up. It helps me regulate the output of my quirk. Relax, kid." "I'm impressed," Tony said, walking in and handing him a mug. It was filled with hot chocolate, rich and dark. "Shows discipline. Lord knows I could use some of that." He took a long sip from his own mug, which undoubtedly contained something far more caffeinated. "Drink up. We're going on a field trip." "A field trip, sir?" Deku asked, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "Yep. We're short-staffed," Tony said, swiping through something on his tablet. "Vision's on lockdown with Wanda, Rhodey's playing politician, and the rest of my so-called friends are planning a jailbreak. I'm down to me, a reformed Russian spy who frankly terrifies me, and a kid who just fell out of the sky. We need one more." He tapped the screen, and a grainy video appeared. It showed a figure in red and blue swinging between buildings on a thin, white strand. The figure was impossibly agile, flipping and twisting in midair, moving with a speed and grace that made Deku's jaw drop. Then, the figure landed on the side of a building, stopping a speeding car with what looked like sheer strength. "Whoa!" Deku breathed, his eyes wide. His quirk, it's like he has multiple abilities. Enhanced strength, speed, agility, and some kind of adhesive power? Plus that web-like substance. Not a quirk, Tony corrected, a smirk playing on his lips. As far as this world's concerned, he's one of a kind. Name's Peter Parker. He's 15. Been doing this for about 6 months, trying to keep it under the radar. Calls himself Spider-Man. Deku's eyes went even wider. A hero, his own age, already active. 15? He doesn't have a license. The protest was automatic, ingrained in him by years of UA doctrine. Kid, nobody here has a license. That's the whole problem, remember? Tony said, deactivating the tablet. I need his help. And I think it might be good for you to come along. See how we do recruitment on this side of the pond. Besides, he added, looking from the video back to Deku, I want to see how my 2 new science fair prodigies get along. Finish your cocoa. We leave in 20. The apartment building in Queens was old, unassuming, and quintessentially New York. It was a world away from the gleaming futurism of the Avengers compound. As they walked up the 5 flights of stairs, Tony complaining under his breath the entire way, Deku felt a nervous tremor in his hands. He was about to meet another hero. A real one. What would he say? Would he be impressed by One for All? Or would he think Deku's costume was lame? Tony knocked on the door of apartment 20. A moment later, it was opened by a woman with a warm, kind face and kindling in her eyes. May Parker. Oh, Mr. Stark, she said, her voice a mix of surprise and delight. What a pleasant surprise. Her eyes flickered to Deku, who was standing awkwardly behind Tony, his posture ramrod straight. And you brought a friend. May, it's a pleasure, Tony said, turning on a level of charm that was almost a physical force. This is Izuku. He's a foreign exchange student. My new intern, here as part of the September Foundation's cultural outreach program. Deku, realizing he was being addressed, bowed stiffly from the waist. It is an honor to meet you, Mrs. Parker, he said in his most formal English. May blinked, taken aback, then broke into a wide smile. Oh, aren't you just the sweetest thing? Please call me May. Come in, come in. Peter's in his room. He's going to be so thrilled. She led them into a small, cozy living room filled with mismatched furniture and framed photos. It felt warm and lived in, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of the compound. It reminded Deku, painfully, of his own apartment back home. Peter! You have guests! May called out. A moment later, Peter Parker appeared from a side hallway. He was thin, with a mop of brown hair and wide, intelligent eyes that were currently blown wide with utter shock. He stared at Tony Stark, then at Deku, and back to Tony, his mouth agape. Hi, Peter managed, his voice cracking. What are you? Mr. Stark, what are you doing here? It's about the grant, Tony said smoothly, striding into the room as if he owned it. The September Foundation. I approved your application. Peter's eyes darted nervously between Tony and his aunt. The grant? Yeah. You know, Tony prompted, making a vague gesture. The one you applied for. Right, Peter squeaked, nodding frantically. Deku watched the entire exchange from the doorway, feeling like an intruder at a play he didn't have the script for. He could feel the tension radiating off Peter. It was the same kind of nervous energy he himself felt whenever All Might was in the room, a frantic mix of awe and the desperate need to not say something stupid. He analyzed Peter's posture, his flickering gaze, the slight tremor in his hands. This was a kid with a secret, a very big secret, and he was terrified of it being discovered. Deku knew the feeling all too well. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in deflection and misdirection. Tony talked about the non-existent grant, May offered them date loaf, and Peter looked like he was about to have a full-blown panic attack. Eventually, Tony steered the conversation to getting a moment alone with Peter in his room. Peter's room was a chaotic explosion of teenage life. Clothes were strewn on the floor, textbooks were piled high on a desk, and intricate-looking circuit boards and half-finished gadgets were scattered everywhere. Tucked away in a corner, Deku spotted a vintage computer tower with the side panel removed, its innards a complex nest of wires. He builds his own computers. From scavenged parts? Deku's respect for him grew instantly. Tony closed the door, and the pretense dropped. Alright, I'm gonna sit here, so you move the leg, he said, plopping down on Peter's bed. Deku, meanwhile, hovered awkwardly near the door, trying to take up as little space as possible. Tony wasted no time. He found Peter's hidden web shooters, marveled at the webbing's tensile strength, and then, with a flick of his wrist, activated a hidden projector that displayed Spider-Man footage on the ceiling. So, Tony said conversationally, as Peter scrambled to shut it off. You're the Spiderling. Crime-fighting spider. You're Spider-Boy? As Spider-Man, Peter corrected, his face pale. Not in that onesie, you're not, Tony retorted. As Tony laid out the situation, the Accords, the fight with Captain America, the need for his help, Deku watched Peter. He saw the kid's initial awe give way to a profound sense of conflict. This wasn't just a game. Tony was asking him to fight Captain America. Look, kid, Tony said, his voice serious. There's a lot going on here that you don't understand. Mr. Stark, you don't think I understand? Peter shot back, a sudden fire in his voice. You think I'm just a kid? I know what's at stake. When you can do the things that I can, but you don't, and then the bad things happen? They happen because of you. The words struck Deku like a physical blow. They were a perfect, eloquent crystallization of the very philosophy that had driven him since the day he first rushed to save Bakugo from the sludge villain. It was the core principle of heroism. It was the reason he was here. He stared at Peter, a newfound sense of kinship blooming in his chest. Tony was clearly impressed. He nodded slowly. So you're in? Peter hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. Yeah. I'm in. Good, Tony said, standing up. Now, where's your suit? Peter looked flustered. It's in the closet. Tony strode over and flung the closet doors open, revealing a jumble of clothes and a hidden compartment in the ceiling. Okay, secret compartment. Not bad, Parker. He looked up into the space. Oh, what? Peter asked, his voice full of dread. Tony reached up. Someone's been a very busy boy. He pulled down the familiar red and blue suit, but it was already held in the grip of a thick, white, web-like substance. Peter's eyes widened in horror. Oh man! Suddenly, Tony yelled under his and yanked his hand back. A figure in the red and blue suit dropped from the ceiling, landing in a perfect three-point crouch. The suit was different though, sleeker, with black accents and eyes that mechanically whirred as they narrowed and widened. Nice, Tony said with satisfaction. I took the liberty of a little upgrade. Peter, the real Peter, was still standing by the desk, looking at his own webbing with bewilderment. He looked at the new Spider-Man, then at Tony. Wait, if that's my suit, then who are you? The new Spider-Man stood up, the whirring eyes of his mask retracting to reveal a completely normal, empty suit. Tony smirked, holding up a small remote. Prototype stealth drone technology. Had to make sure you were the real deal first. And that your secret identity was, secret. He tossed a small, metallic spider-shaped object to Peter. The real suit's in here. Nanotech. Compresses for easy storage. Told you I had an upgrade for you. Peter fumbled with the device, his expression a mix of relief, confusion, and utter awe. It was in that moment of stunned silence that Deku finally spoke. The tensile strength of your webbing is incredible, he said, his voice quiet but intense. Peter and Tony both turned to look at him, as if they'd forgotten he was there. To stop a car moving at that velocity, assuming standard mass and friction coefficients, it would need to withstand a force of over 3,000 pounds per square inch. Is it a silicon-based polymer? How do you account for shear stress during sudden impacts? Peter stared at him. The panic and anxiety drained from his face, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated excitement. It was the look of one nerd who has just found another member of his tribe. Oh my God, you get it! Peter exclaimed, rushing over to his desk and grabbing a notebook. It's a carbon chain polymer, but the key is the rapid crystallization upon contact with air. I've been trying to solve the shear stress problem with a non-Newtonian fluid additive, but it makes the viscosity too high for the firing mechanism. How did you know to ask that? I analyze heroes, Deku said, pulling out his own battered notebook. It's what I do. In my world, we call them quirks. I've been trying to figure out how your abilities work. I hypothesize that you have a subconscious, extrasensory perception that allows you to calculate trajectories and react to threats precognitively. Is that right? Whoa, that's way more technical than how I'd put it, but yeah. I call it my Peter tingle, Peter said, his voice buzzing with energy. Wait, what do you mean, your world? Tony clapped his hands together, a broad grin on his face. Okay, science twins, that's enough. We can compare notes on the jet. May's date loaf is calling my name, and we have a plane to catch. The car ride back to the compound was a whirlwind of excited, high-speed chatter that left Tony feeling both proud and profoundly old. Peter and Deku sat in the back, notebooks open, firing questions and theories at each other like machine gun fire. So one for all stockpiles raw kinetic energy? Is it cellular? Does it have a metabolic cost? Because my healing factor drains my blood sugar like you wouldn't believe. A healing factor too? That's amazing. Yes, there's a huge metabolic cost, but it also reinforces the body to handle the output. But your web shooters. You machined the nozzles yourself? The precision required for that kind of aperture is incredible. It was mostly trial and error. Lots of error. I accidentally webbed my ceiling to my floor for a week. But quirks. So anyone can have one? Like the mailman could have laser eyes? Not usually that powerful, but yes. The genetic expression is fascinatingly diverse. Tony just drove, listening to them. He'd brought 2 kids into a war. The thought had been a heavy weight on his conscience, but listening to them now, hearing their shared passion, their intelligence, their sheer, unadulterated goodness, he felt a flicker of something else. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, he was building something more than just a temporary team. Maybe he was building the future. The next 2 days at the compound were a blur of activity. While Tony and Natasha Romanoff coordinated logistics for their trip to Germany, Peter and Deku were given the run of the state-of-the-art training facility. It was a hero nerd's paradise. Their first sparring session was a fascinating clash of styles. Okay, FRIDY, Tony's voice crackled over the intercom. Run Combat Simulation 7. Non-lethal parameters. Go. Peter was a chaotic, unpredictable whirlwind. He used the entire space, swinging from the ceiling, bouncing off walls, his movements fluid and impossible to track. He peppered Deku with web gobs, not to restrain him, but to disorient him, to force him to move in predictable ways. Deku, in his own world, was a prodigy of speed and power, but here, against Peter, he felt slow and clumsy. Hold still. Deku grunted, launching himself forward in a burst of green lightning. Dude, if I hold still, you'll punch me into next week. Peter quipped, effortlessly backflipping over Deku's head and sticking to the ceiling. The spider sense, the Peter tingle, was the ultimate defense. Every move Deku made, every feint and every charge, Peter seemed to anticipate it a fraction of a second before it happened. Deku couldn't land a single clean hit. Frustrated, he skidded to a halt, panting. Peter hung upside down from a web line, tilting his masked head. You're broadcasting your moves, Peter said. You tense your shoulders right before you dash, and you plant your back foot before you jump. I know what you're gonna do before you do it. Deku's eyes widened. He had been so focused on raw power for so long, he hadn't realized how predictable his movements had become. His mind went into its familiar muttering analysis. He's right. Reliance on full cowling speed has made my initial movements too obvious. He's not just reacting, he's reading me. I need to be more erratic. Unpredictable. Like Kaken. Their second session was different. Deku didn't charge. He moved in short, sharp bursts, changing direction randomly. He used Delaware smashes not as attacks, but as environmental tools, flicking compressed air to kick up dust clouds for cover or to create diversions that would momentarily overwhelm Peter's senses. Peter, in turn, adapted. He stopped relying solely on acrobatics and started using his webs strategically, creating complex, sticky lattices across the room, turning the training floor into a giant, three-dimensional maze designed to slow Deku down. It was in their third session that something clicked. They weren't just sparring anymore, they were collaborating. Tony had FRIDY Project holographic training drones into the room. "Web me!" Deku shouted, as 3 drones cornered him. Without hesitation, Peter fired a webline that stuck to Deku's back. Just as the drones fired their simulated lasers, Peter yanked, pulling Deku into the air, allowing him to flip over the drones and land behind them. "Now!" Peter yelled, and Deku, without looking, stomped his foot. St. Louis smash! The shockwave of air rippled outwards, stunning the drones long enough for Peter to swing in and web them all into a single, wriggling cocoon. They stood back to back, breathing heavily, a perfect, synchronized unit. From the observation deck, Tony watched with a rare, genuine smile. That night they sat on the roof of the main building, the cool night air a welcome relief after the intensity of their training. The sky was clear, a blanket of stars spread out above them, more than Deku had ever seen in the light-polluted skies of Muzurifu. "I still can't believe this is real," Peter said, breaking the comfortable silence. "A week ago, my biggest problem was a history test. Now I'm about to fly to Germany to fight Captain America." He hugged his knees to his chest. "It's terrifying." "I know," Deku said quietly. He was looking at his hands, at the faint scars that mapped his journey with One for All. "In my world, Captain America he's a legend. A comic book hero, the ultimate symbol of doing the right thing. It feels wrong to fight him." "Then why are you?" Peter asked, his voice gentle. Deku was silent for a long moment. He thought of Lagos. He thought of the Hero Public Safety Commission. He thought of the crushing weight of responsibility that settled on your shoulders the moment you chose to use your power to help others. "Because Mr. Stark is right," Deku said, finally looking at Peter. "Power needs to be responsible. Where I come from, it's the most important lesson. We can't just decide for ourselves who to save and what rules to follow. If we do, if we put ourselves above the law, we're not heroes anymore. We're just vigilantes." Peter nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "My Uncle Ben, he used to say something like that. He told me that with great power comes great responsibility." He looked down at his hands. "I lost him. I could have stopped the guy who did it, but I didn't. I was arrogant. I thought my powers made me special, that the rules didn't apply to me." His voice was thick with an old, familiar pain. "I can't make that mistake again. Mr. Stark, he's trying to do the responsible thing. It's the hard thing, but it's the right thing. I have to help him." Deku finally understood. They were both here for the same reason. They weren't fighting for Tony Stark, not really. They were fighting for the memories of the people who had inspired them. For All Might, for Uncle Ben. They were fighting for the crushing, beautiful burden of responsibility. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, which Tony's tech team had managed to get working. He swiped to a picture he always kept on the home screen. It was a class photo of 1A, taken after the sports festival. They were all there, a chaotic, vibrant, smiling group. He felt a sharp pang of homesickness, of longing. "I was powerless my whole life," Deku said, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't know why he was telling Peter this, his deepest, most guarded secret. It just felt right. "My quirk, it was given to me, by the hero I admire most in the world. He told me I could be a hero, even when everyone else, including myself, believed I couldn't." He looked at Peter, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I can't let him down. I have to prove that he was right to believe in me." Peter looked at the photo on Deku's phone, then back at his new friend's face. He saw the same fierce determination, the same immense weight of expectation, that he saw in the mirror every morning. He didn't know who All Might was, but he understood perfectly. "You won't let him down," Peter said, with a conviction that startled them both. "We won't." A comfortable silence fell between them again, no longer two strangers from different worlds, but two kids bound by the same impossible purpose. The moment was broken by the hiss of a door opening behind them. Tony Stark stepped out onto the roof, holding two metallic briefcases. "Hope I'm not interrupting your secret rooftop meeting," he said, his tone light. "But FRIDY finished the new suits. Thought you might want to try them on before the big day." He set the briefcases down and popped them open. Inside, nestled in black foam, were their new costumes. Peter's was the sleek, advanced iron spider suit Deku had seen in the test drone, and next to it was his own. Deku gasped. It was based on his Gamma costume design, but it was a world away from the simple fabric and armor plates he was used to. It was made of a dark green, nanoweave material that shimmered under the moonlight. The armor plating was sleeker, more integrated, with thin lines of light that seemed to pulse with a soft green energy. The gloves and boots were reinforced with a metallic sheen, and the mask had been redesigned, the familiar ears now more aerodynamic, with what looked like a built-in comms system and a heads-up display. It's a carbon fiber triweave with a vibranium-laced impact gel layer, Tony explained, sounding like a proud father showing off a new toy. It'll help absorb the kinetic backlash from your smashes. Should give you a little more protection against, your own skeleton trying to escape your body. Plus, it's got a full sensor suite and a direct link to FRIDY. Deku reached out a trembling hand and touched the suit. It felt cool, strong, and impossibly advanced. It was a gift. A symbol of trust. He looked up at Tony, then at Peter, who was staring at his own new suit with equal parts reverence and excitement. They were a team. A strange, cobbled-together team of a billionaire, a boy from another dimension, and a kid from Queens. Get some sleep, you two, Tony said, his voice softer than usual. We fly for Leipzig at 0600. He left them there with their new identities. As Deku stared at the suit, the fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach. But now, it was mixed with something else. A sense of belonging. A shared purpose. He wasn't just Izuku Midoriya, the lost student from UA anymore. He was Deku. And he was a member of the Avengers. The journey to Leipzig was a study in silence. The interior of the Quinjet, a marvel of Stark engineering that was sleeker and far more weaponized than any hero transport Deku had ever seen, was filled with a low, oppressive hum. It was the sound of engines straining against the atmosphere, a sound that mirrored the tension coiling in the cabin. No one spoke. The easy camaraderie Deku had shared with Peter in the training room had evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of their destination. Deku sat strapped into a seat across from Peter, his new suit contained in a metallic briefcase at his feet. He had his notebook open on his lap, but he wasn't writing. He was staring at the pages, at the detailed analyses he'd compiled from the files Tony had given him. Clint Barton. Hawkeye. A master marksman with no discernible superhuman abilities, yet he stood shoulder to shoulder with gods and super soldiers. Deku's notes were filled with admiration for his tactical ingenuity, his trick arrows, his sheer, audacious courage. He was a hero in the purest sense, a normal man who had trained himself to be extraordinary. Sam Wilson. The Falcon. An ex-pararescue airman with a high-tech flight suit. Deku had sketched the wing harness, marveling at its articulation and control surfaces. He was a soldier, loyal and steadfast, a man who followed his friend and his conscience. Wanda Maximoff. The Scarlet Witch. The file on her was heavily redacted, but what was there was terrifying and tragic. Telekinesis, telepathy, reality manipulation. Her power was immense, born from trauma. She wasn't a villain, she was a victim, a young woman struggling with a power she hadn't asked for. Deku felt a profound sympathy for her. He was memorizing their abilities, their histories, their psychological profiles. It was what he always did before a fight. He analyzed. He prepared. But this was different. He wasn't preparing to fight villains. He was preparing to fight heroes. Every strength he identified was a potential weakness to be exploited. Every commendable trait was a factor to be manipulated. The thought left a sour, metallic taste in his mouth. Peter was quiet beside him, his mask in his lap. He stared at the intricate design of the lenses, his leg bouncing with a nervous energy he couldn't contain. He was just a kid from Queens, a boy who made gadgets in his bedroom. Now he was about to face legends. The weight of it was visible in the tight line of his jaw. At the front of the cabin, Tony stood with James Rhodey Rhodes, both men encased in their respective armors, helmets retracted. Rhodey's war machine suit was a bulky, gunmetal-gray beast, bristling with ordnance. His face was a mask of professional solemnity. He was a soldier following an order, but his eyes betrayed the deep conflict he felt. Tony's face was unreadable. His usual manic energy had been distilled into a sharp, dangerous focus. He was no longer the charming, sarcastic mentor. He was Iron Man, a man on a mission, willing to pay any price to see it through. And then there was the Black Panther. He sat alone, perfectly still, his sleek, black vibranium suit absorbing the cabin light. He hadn't spoken a word since boarding. He was a king, a warrior, a man driven by a singular, cold purpose, vengeance for his father's death. He was not here for the Accords. He was here for the Winter Soldier. His presence was that of a predator, patient and coiled, and it added a layer of lethal gravity to the already volatile situation. Deku closed his notebook. The analysis felt hollow. He could break down their abilities, predict their movements, but he couldn't reconcile the fundamental wrongness of it all. He was here because he believed in accountability, in the system. But the system was a cold, abstract concept. These people, they were real. They were heroes. A strange, cold static buzzed at the base of his skull, a sensation that was becoming unnervingly familiar. It was the whisper of the vestiges, a murmur from the ghosts inside One for All. He felt a flicker of a memory that wasn't his, a woman with a determined smile, a floating black ponytail, and a heart full of fierce, protective love. Nana Shimura. Her voice was not a sound, but a feeling, a thought that bloomed in his mind with her conviction. A leash is still a leash, boy, no matter how noble the hand that holds it. The thought was a jolt, a splinter of doubt in the foundation of his logic. He believed in the law, in rules, but Nana Shimura had fought against the ultimate tyrant, all for one, a man who represented absolute, suffocating control. She had died for the freedom of others. Would she stand with him now, or would she be on the other side of that line, standing beside the man who refused to surrender his freedom to choose? He shook his head, trying to clear the phantom voice. He had made his choice. He had to believe it was the right one. We're here, Tony's voice cut through the cabin, sharp and final. The Quinjet descended with a smooth, silent grace. Through the cockpit viewport, Deku could see the Leipzig/Halle airport. It was vast and eerily empty, a ghost of its usual bustling self. A lone helicopter sat on a helipad a few hundred meters away. Captain America's ride. The ramp lowered with a low hiss, opening onto the gray, wind-swept tarmac. The air was cool and smelled of rain and jet fuel. One by one, they stepped out into the open. The sheer, empty space felt like an arena. "All right," Tony said, his helmet snapping shut with a definitive thunk. "Let's get this over with." He handed the two briefcases to Peter and Deku. "Suit up." Deku placed the briefcase on the ground and tapped the central seal. It sprang open with a pneumatic hiss. He placed his hand on the condensed dark green mass within. "FRIDY," he whispered, his heart hammering in his chest. "Activate costume." "Welcome, Midoriya." The calm, feminine voice of the AI spoke, not from a speaker, but directly inside his head. The sensation was jarring. Hero designation Deku online. The nanites swarmed up his body in a wave of cool, liquid metal. It was a completely alien sensation, nothing like pulling on a fabric suit. It felt like a second skin, forming and solidifying around him. The dark green material contoured to his muscles, the sleek armor plates hardening over his chest, shoulders, and legs. Thin, circuit-like lines pulsed with a soft green light, mirroring the energy of One for All. The boots clamped onto his feet with a satisfying weight, and the redesigned cowl formed over his head, the heads-up display flickering to life before his eyes. Data scrolled across his vision, atmospheric pressure, wind speed, his own biometric readings. A mini-map in the corner showed the layout of the airport, with friendly IFF tags glowing blue. "Whoa," Peter's voice crackled over the comms. A channel FRIDY had automatically opened between them. "This is insane. It smells like a new car in here. Is your suit talking to you?" "Mine's talking to me." Deku looked over at Peter. The Iron Spider suit was a work of art, sleek and powerful, the metallic red and blue gleaming in the overcast light. Four articulated spider legs were currently retracted into a pack on his back. "Yes," Deku replied, his own voice sounding tinny and distant through the suit's internal microphone. "Mr. Stark, the sensory input is incredible. Just try not to break it, kids," Tony's voice replied, all business. Remember the plan. We go in, we talk. If they don't listen, we go for containment. Non-lethal takedowns. Your job is to handle the runners. Midoriya, you're the battering ram. Parker, you're the glue. Stick to the plan. They began to walk, their footsteps echoing on the vast, empty tarmac. Deku fell into step beside Spider-Man, with Iron Man, War Machine, and Black Panther flanking them. In the distance, another group of figures emerged from behind a row of service vehicles, 5 of them. No, 6. Captain America was at their head. Deku's breath caught in his throat. It was one thing to see him on a screen, to read about him in a file. It was another thing entirely to see him in the flesh. He was exactly as the legends described. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with an easy confidence that radiated strength. The iconic red, white, and blue suit wasn't garish, it was a statement. The shield on his arm gleamed, a perfect circle of defiance. But it was his eyes that held Deku captive. They were clear, blue, and filled with a fierce, unwavering conviction. There was no doubt in them, no fear. Only the absolute certainty that he was doing the right thing. This was the man who had charged into a Hydra base armed with little more than a metal shield and a good heart. The man who had pulled a pin on a grenade and thrown himself on top of it to save his comrades. The man who had sacrificed himself, crashing his plane into the Arctic to save millions. This was a hero. A true hero. Every rational argument Deku had constructed, every logical reason for siding with Tony Stark, suddenly felt like sand crumbling in his fists. His heart, his very soul, screamed at him that he was on the wrong side. The cold whisper of Nana Shimura returned, no longer a murmur, but a clear, chiming bell in his mind. This is a man who would never wear a leash. Tony must have sensed his hesitation, the slight falter in his step. Stay focused, kid, he said, his voice a low command in Deku's ear. They stopped, the two teams facing each other across a 20-yard gap of empty tarmac. A line had been drawn. Wow, Peter whispered, his voice full of awe. It's Captain America. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken history, with fractured friendships and irreconcilable beliefs. You seem a little defensive, Tony's voice projected from his helmet, breaking the tension. It's been a long day, Captain America replied, his voice calm and steady, carrying easily across the distance. At ease, soldier, Tony said, retracting his helmet. I'm not currently after you. Then why are you here? Your Bucky, Tony said, his tone hardening. He's killed innocent people, and there are 5 more super soldiers just like him, Steve retorted. I can't let a doctor or you get to them first. The words went back and forth, a volley of accusations and justifications. Deku listened, his mind a maelstrom. He understood both sides. Tony was right about Bucky's past actions. Captain America was right about the future threat. They were both trying to do good. They were both trying to be heroes. And that was the tragedy. Finally, Steve turned his gaze from Tony and looked directly at the 2 youngest members of his team. His eyes, full of that unwavering conviction, settled on Deku, then on Peter. The look wasn't one of anger or aggression. It was one of profound, soul-crushing disappointment. Stark, Steve said, his voice laced with a new, sharp edge of disapproval. You brought kids? The words hit Deku harder than any physical blow. Kid. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a peer. He was just a child, a pawn in a game played by adults. The shame was a hot flush that spread through his entire body. They're not kids, Tony shot back defensively. They're assets. And they're on the right side of the law. The law? Steve's gaze didn't leave them. They don't understand what they're signing away. You're using them. I'm giving them a choice, Steve. The same one you're refusing to make. Peter, next to Deku, shifted his weight, the lenses of his mask widening and narrowing. He's not using us, he said, his voice trying for a confidence it didn't quite possess. We chose this. Captain America's expression softened into something that was almost worse than disappointment, pity. Son, you don't know what you're choosing. Deku couldn't stay silent. His mind was screaming, his heart was at war with his head, but his mouth opened, and the words tumbled out, desperate and earnest. Captain, sir, he began, taking a hesitant step forward. All eyes turned to him. He's not using us. I believe in what we're doing. He took a breath, forcing the words out, trying to make his idol understand. In my world, heroes need to be held accountable. It's the most important rule. It's to protect people. I've seen it, sir. I've seen what happens when power isn't controlled, when heroes fight without thinking about the consequences. People get hurt. Cities get destroyed. The Accords, they're not a leash. They're a promise to the world that we'll be better. That we'll be responsible. His plea hung in the air, heartfelt and raw. He had laid his entire ideology bare, the core of his heroic identity, and offered it to Captain America as a bridge across the chasm that separated them. For a moment, there was silence. Captain America looked at him, truly looked at him, and Deku saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not agreement, but perhaps a sliver of understanding. He saw the earnest, heroic spirit in the boy in the green suit, but his own conviction was a mountain, immovable and absolute. Son, Captain America said, his voice gentle but firm, and Deku's heart sank. Some things you can't compromise on. Freedom is one of them. We're not leaving without Bucky. He looked back at Tony, his expression hardening once more. This is your last chance. You walk away. Not happening, Tony said, his own voice grim. A beautiful woman with auburn hair, Black Widow, spoke for the first time. Steve, you know what's about to happen. Please. Don't do this. Captain America looked at his team, then back at Tony's. His gaze was full of regret, but no hesitation. I'm sorry, Tony, he said, and it sounded genuine. You know I wouldn't do this if I had any other choice. He raised his hands. But he's my friend. So was I, Tony shot back, the hurt in his voice raw and real. His helmet snapped back into place. The air crackled with anticipation. Every muscle in Deku's body was tense, coiled for a fight he desperately didn't want. This was it. The moment where words failed. The moment where heroes became enemies. All right, Captain America said, his voice now a commander's bark. We're going. Suddenly, a voice echoed in Deku's ear, sharp and urgent. It was Peter. Mr. Stark? Something's coming. Deku's eyes darted to his HUD. A tiny, fast-moving projectile was arcing through the air. A warning icon flashed. Incoming projectile. Everybody down. Tony yelled. An arrow, trailing a thin wire, slammed into the tarmac at their feet. It wasn't an attack. It was a signal. Cap, Clint Barton's voice crackled over a stolen comms frequency that FRIDY instantly patched into their headsets. Heads up. Captain America raised his shield just as Spider-Man shot a web, yanking it from his grasp. The shield flew through the air. At the same time, a figure, Ant-Man, Scott Lang, ex-con, can shrink, Deku's mind supplied, suddenly appeared on the shield in midair, growing to full size. He kicked Spider-Man squarely in the chest, sending him tumbling, and then flipped the shield back into Captain America's waiting hand. I believe this is yours, Captain America, Ant-Man said, his voice starstruck. The world erupted into chaos. Iron Man and War Machine launched into the air, repulsor blasts screaming. Black Panther surged forward, a blur of black motion, his vibranium claws extended, his target singular, the Winter Soldier. Falcon's wings deployed, and he soared into the sky, firing his submachine guns. Wanda's hands glowed with terrifying red energy, and cars and luggage containers began to lift from the ground, turning the entire tarmac into a weaponized obstacle course. The line had been crossed. The talking was over. Deku stood frozen for a half-second, the sheer, epic, tragic reality of the scene overwhelming him. He was in a war. A war of heroes. Midoriya, go! Tony's voice yelled in his ear, snapping him out of his trance. Containment. Now! He took a deep breath, the filtered air of his suit feeling cold in his lungs. He pushed Nana's voice down. He pushed down the image of Captain America's disappointed eyes. He pushed down the part of him that was screaming in protest. He had made a promise. He had a job to do, one for all, full cowling. 8%. The familiar green lightning crackled to life, arcing over the sleek, dark green of his new suit. He crouched low, digging his armored boots into the asphalt. and then he launched himself into the heart of the storm. The battlefield was a symphony of chaos, a discordant orchestra of repulsor blasts, the sharp thwip of webbing, the roar of jet turbines, and the sickening crunch of metal on metal. For Izuku Midoriya, it was a sensory overload unlike anything he had ever experienced. His HUD flashed with a constant stream of threat assessments, trajectory analyses, and biometric readings, all vying for his attention. Friday's calm voice was a steady presence in his ear, but it was nearly drowned out by the thunder of his own heart. He had a mission: containment. Tony's orders were clear. Incapacitate, don't injure. Subdue, don't maim. It was a hero's directive, but in the swirling vortex of this conflict, the line between the two felt terrifyingly thin. Every instinct, honed through brutal training at UA, and trial-by-fire battles against villains, screamed at him to strike hard, to end the fight quickly. But these weren't villains. He had to hold back. His first target was a strategic one. Captain America and the Winter Soldier were making a break for the hangar where the Quinjet was docked. They were the primary objective, but cutting them off was the Falcon, Sam Wilson, soaring through the air like a bird of prey, laying down a hail of suppressive fire with his Steyr SPP machine pistols. Can't get to the captain while Falcon controls the sky, Deku muttered, his voice a low, analytical hum inside his helmet. The habit was so ingrained, not even a dimensional rift and a supersuit could break it. His flight suit provides superior mobility and a vertical advantage. Direct assault is inefficient. Need to ground him. His wings, they're articulated, likely dependent on a central control unit. Disrupt the unit, disrupt the flight. He changed his trajectory, a green blur against the gray tarmac. He pushed one for all to 10%, the suit's internal gel layer vibrating as it absorbed the strain that would normally make his bones ache. He leaped, a single, explosive bound that carried him 50 feet into the air, directly into Sam's flight path. Sam's eyes widened behind his goggles. He hadn't expected an aerial opponent who didn't have his own wings. "Whoa, where'd you come from, Green Bean?" he yelled, banking hard to his left. A small, cylindrical drone, Redwing, detached from his pack and fired a volley of micro-missiles. Deku's HUD instantly tagged the projectiles. He twisted in midair, a feat of impossible acrobatics. He didn't try to dodge. Instead, he met the attack head-on. Delaware smash! Air Force! He flicked his fingers, not with the full force of a smash, but with a series of small, rapid-fire bursts of compressed air. Each flick was precisely aimed, creating a defensive screen of kinetic force. The micro-missiles detonated prematurely, a series of bright, harmless pops in the air around him. The shockwave from his own attack, however, was enough to send the much lighter Redwing drone tumbling out of the sky. "Hey, Redwing!" Sam cried out in alarm, diving after his drone. It was the opening Deku needed. As Sam swooped down, Deku used the last of his upward momentum to kick off the side of a luggage container that Wanda had hurled into the air moments before. He was now above the Falcon. He fell, a human missile aimed at the center of Sam's back. "Sorry about this," Deku yelled. He didn't strike. He landed, his armored boots clamping onto the wing harness itself. The impact was jarring, sending them both into an uncontrolled spiral. Sam grunted, fighting for control, the turbines on his wings screaming in protest against the sudden, unexpected weight. "Get off me, kid!" Sam roared, trying to execute a barrel roll to shake him. Deku held on, his fingers digging for purchase on the cold metal. He found what he was looking for, a central power conduit, glowing with a soft blue light. He didn't try to rip it out. That would cause a catastrophic failure, sending them both plummeting to the ground. Instead, he channeled a tiny, precise thread of 1 for all, less than 1%, into his fingertips and pressed. The surge of bioenergy was just enough to short out the connection. The wings seized, locking in place. The turbines sputtered and died. They were now in a freefall. "Mayday, mayday! I'm a rock!" Sam shouted into his comms. "I've got you!" Deku grunted, wrapping his arms around Sam's chest from behind. He kicked off the now useless wing pack, pushing them away from the metal appendage. He angled his body, using his own form as a makeshift air brake. He hit the ground in a running crouch, the impact rattling his teeth even with the suit's dampeners, but Sam was safe. Before Sam could even get his bearings, Peter swung in, a blur of red and blue. Thwip, thwip, thwip. In seconds, Sam was expertly cocooned in thick, sticky webbing, pinned to the side of a baggage cart. Nice flying falcon, Peter quipped, his voice buzzing with adrenaline. He landed next to Deku, the articulated legs of his suit giving a little hiss. Dude, that was awesome! You were all like, whoosh, and he was like, arg, and then you were like, bam, good work you two. Tony's voice cut in. Panther is engaging the Winter Soldier. I need you to back him up. Keep Barnes contained. The two teens looked at each other and nodded. They sprinted across the tarmac, a synchronized whirlwind of green lightning and acrobatic flips. They arrived to see a dance of deadly grace. Bucky Barnes, the Winter Soldier, was a storm of brutal efficiency, his vibranium arm a silver blur. But T'Challa, the Black Panther, was his equal and more. He moved with a liquid, predatory grace, his own vibranium claws deflecting Bucky's attacks, leaving glowing purple trails of kinetic energy in their wake. We have to stop them, Deku said, his mind racing. Black Panther is fighting with lethal intent. Vengeance. Barnes is fighting for survival. Intervening directly is too risky. T'Challa's suit absorbs kinetic energy. My smashes might just make him stronger. I've got an idea! Peter yelled. Distraction! Peter launched himself high, firing a webline at a towering gantry crane far above the battlefield. While he swung, Deku made his move. He didn't charge at either fighter. He charged at the ground between them. St. Louis smash! He brought his leg down in a powerful axe kick, pouring 10% of his power into the blow. The tarmac cracked and buckled, a wave of displaced air and debris erupting outwards. Both Bucky and T'Challa were thrown off balance by the sudden, localized earthquake. Bucky recovered first, his combat instincts screaming at him. He saw Deku as the immediate threat and charged, his metal fist raised. Deku braced himself, ready to block, to parry, to hold back. He never had to. Thwip! A webline shot past his head and snagged Bucky's metal wrist. A second later, Peter, swinging in from his high arc, slammed feet first into Bucky's chest. The combined force of the swing and the kick sent the Winter Soldier flying backward, where he was immediately snagged by 3 more expertly aimed webs, pinning him against the side of a jet bridge. You have a metal arm? That is awesome, dude! Peter chattered, rapidly encasing Bucky's limbs in more webbing. T'Challa, however, was not so easily deterred. He rose to his feet, his glowing purple eyes fixed on the trapped Bucky. He lunged, his claws ready for the killing blow. Deku moved without thinking. He put himself directly in the panther's path, arms spread wide. Stop! He yelled. This isn't justice. It's revenge! The Black Panther didn't even slow down. He swatted Deku aside with a backhand that felt like being hit by a freight train. The vibranium suit had absorbed the energy from Deku's smash, and it was now amplifying T'Challa's already superhuman strength. Deku flew 20 feet and crashed into a pile of luggage, his HUD flickering with warning signs. Impact warning, minor spinal trauma detected. Biofoam injected. A cool sensation spread across his back as the suit's medical system did its work. He pushed himself up, his body aching, and saw T'Challa about to bring his claws down on Bucky's throat. No! Deku poured everything he could into his legs. 15%. The pain was a sharp, familiar fire. He crossed the distance in a single, blinding flash of green light. He arrived just as T'Challa's claws began to descend. He couldn't stop the blow, but he could redirect it. He slammed his armored shoulder into T'Challa's side. The angle of the attack changed. Instead of plunging into Bucky's neck, the vibranium claws raked across his metal arm, creating a screech of protesting metal and a shower of sparks. T'Challa whirled on him, his silent rage a palpable force. You have the heart of a warrior, child, he said, his voice a low, regal growl, filtered through his mask. But you are in my way. Before T'Challa could strike again, a red-gold blur slammed into him. Iron Man. Your Highness, I think that's enough, Tony said, his repulsors charged and aimed at T'Challa's chest. We need him alive. T'Challa looked from Tony, to the webbed-up Bucky, to Deku, who was slowly getting back to his feet. With a final, frustrated growl, he retracted his claws and gave a curt nod. He had been stopped for now. "Good work, kids," Tony said, turning his attention back to the larger battle. "But it's not over yet. Look alive!" Deku looked up, and his jaw dropped. Across the tarmac, Scott Lang, Ant-Man, had done the impossible. He had reversed the PIM particles. He was growing. Taller than the terminal building, taller than the air traffic control tower. He was a colossus, a giant in a red and black suit. "Giant man. Oh, you gotta be kidding me," Peter breathed, his voice a mixture of terror and absolute delight. "He's so big!" Giant Man swatted War Machine out of the sky like a fly. He grabbed the wing of the Quinjet Tony had intended to use for his escape and ripped it clean off. He was a game changer. A force of nature. "Okay, anybody on our side hiding any shocking and fantastic abilities they'd like to disclose?" Tony asked, his voice strained. "I'm all ears." Deku watched the giant wreak havoc. His analytical mind, momentarily stunned, kicked back into gear. "Immense size and strength, but physics must still apply. Square cube law. His mass is increasing exponentially more than his structural integrity. He must be under enormous strain. He's powerful, but he's also a giant, slow-moving target, and his balance, a high center of gravity, makes him vulnerable to trips." "I have an idea!" Peter yelled, his own tactical mind clearly on the same wavelength. "It's from this really old movie, The Empire Strikes Back. You guys have that one here, right? Paint the picture, Parker!" Tony ordered. "We go for the legs!" Peter shouted. "Weld them up!" It was a brilliant, simple plan. Vision phased through Giant Man's chest, a disruptive but ultimately ineffective move. While the giant was distracted, Iron Man and War Machine flew in low, firing repulsor blasts at his knee joints, forcing him to brace. That was the signal. "Deku, on me!" Peter yelled. The two of them sprinted towards the Colossus. Peter was a blur of motion, swinging around Giant Man's legs, firing webline after webline, creating a thick, multi-layered trap. Deku, meanwhile, ran in a wide circle, using full cowling to build up incredible momentum. "Hey, Tic-Tac!" Peter taunted, drawing the giant's attention. "Your suit is ridiculous," Giant Man grunted, turning and trying to stomp on the annoying insect buzzing around his ankles. He took a step, and his foot, ensnared in the reinforced webbing, was held fast for just a fraction of a second too long. His balance shifted. He began to topple. "Now, Deku!" Tony's voice screamed in his ear. Deku saw his opening. It wasn't about tripping him anymore. It was about bringing him down. Hard. He leaped, a green comet of pure power, launching himself up the giant's falling body like a ramp. He ran up his leg, his torso, his chest, the sheer scale of him dizzying. He could see the panicked eyes of Scott Lang through the giant helmet's visor. He knew what he had to do. The suit was protecting him, absorbing the strain, but this would be more than it could handle. This would hurt. This would break him. It was a price he had paid before. It was a price he was willing to pay again. He pushed past his limits. 20%. 30. 40. The suit's internal gel hardened, trying to contain the raw power, but it was like trying to contain a supernova in a glass jar. Warning alarms screamed across his HUD. Warning, catastrophic power surge detected. Structural integrity compromised. The green lightning around him was no longer a gentle crackle. It was a raging, emerald inferno. The vestiges roared in his mind, a chorus of power and pain. He reached the giant's head, planting his feet on his shoulder. He drew back his right arm, the armor plates groaning and shifting under the impossible strain. "I'm sorry," he whispered, to Scott Lang, to Captain America, to himself. "One for all. 100%. Detroit smash!" The world dissolved into sound and fury. His fist connected with the side of Giant Man's helmet with the force of a meteor strike. The nanite armor on his gauntlet vaporized on impact. The vibranium-laced gel couldn't absorb it all. He felt every bone in his arm, from his knuckles to his shoulder, shatter into 1,000 pieces. The pain was a white-hot, blinding agony that eclipsed thought, eclipsed everything. The shockwave was colossal. It ripped through the air, a visible dome of distorted energy. Every window in the nearby terminal building shattered simultaneously. The smaller service vehicles on the tarmac were tossed aside like toys. For everyone on the battlefield, the effect was devastating. Both teams were blown off their feet by the sheer concussive force of the blow. A cloud of dust and debris rolled across the airport, and Giant Man fell. He didn't just topple. He collapsed, like a puppet with its strings cut. The 100% smash, combined with the catastrophic shock to his system, had knocked Scott Lang unconscious instantly. He shrank as he fell, the massive body deflating with a great whoosh of air, until a normal-sized man in a red and black suit hit the tarmac with a heavy, final thud. For a moment, the battlefield was utterly silent, save for the ringing in everyone's ears and the distant sound of car alarms. The dust began to settle. Everyone stared at the epicenter of the blast. Deku lay crumpled on the tarmac, his body smoking, the green lightning gone. His right arm was a ruin. The advanced StarTech suit was shredded from the shoulder down, revealing the mangled, purple-black limb beneath. It was bent at an unnatural angle, swollen and horrifying, a testament to the terrible power he had just unleashed. Peter was the first to his side, his usual witty banter gone, his voice small and full of horror. "Deku? Izuku? Oh my God! Oh my God!" Tony landed next, his helmet retracting. He stared at Deku's arm, then at the unconscious Scott Lang, then back at the boy who had just won him the battle at such a terrible cost. The look on his face was a complex, unreadable mixture of awe, horror, and a deep, gnawing guilt. On the other side of the field, Captain America slowly pushed himself to his feet. He looked at his fallen teammate, then at the grievously injured boy. The disappointment was gone from his eyes. It had been replaced by a look of grim, reluctant respect. This wasn't just a kid. This was a soldier. A soldier who fought with a ferocity and a willingness to self-destruct that Steve hadn't seen since the war. The fight had been won. The line had been held. But as Deku lay on the cold ground, slipping into shock, the agony of his arm a distant, throbbing drum, he couldn't feel a shred of victory. He could only feel the profound, shattering weight of his choice. He had fought heroes. He had broken himself. And in the sudden, terrible silence of the battlefield, he felt more alone than ever before.